Sorry, guys. Good evening. Hopefully everything is good with you guys. Let's get through with the review questions as we need to. You guys should ask as many questions as you want. I'm supposed to play intramural basketball at 7 against the kids, but if I have to stick around here with you guys, I'm sure we'll have people who can cover for me down there. So I want to make sure you guys are in good shape, especially with a chapter like 28 and 29 where we've got a lot of legislative stuff that's going on with progressivism. So we want to make sure that you guys are in a good place before you take your test tomorrow. Your test tomorrow is going to be on Roosevelt Taft foreign policy, and then also Roosevelt Taft Wilson progressivism, including the decisions that were made. Now, first of all, if you could help me out, just one or two of you. I know that we had a bunch of audio and video issues the last time we did this, and so if one or two of you can just on today's meet, are we coming through okay for you guys to be able to hear and see, or are there any sort of technical problems? I'm hoping that we're good. I'm seeing nobody typing, and so hopefully that doesn't mean that nobody's hearing anything. Let me double check on my device. All right, looks like things are coming through okay, so I'm assuming that you guys are recording this and we'll be watching it later on. If you have any questions, feel free to bounce them in. If you just jump in late, and you find that you need to email me questions, you can absolutely do that as well. So, the review session, the review questions that I have start off with the question, can I explain the causes of the Roosevelt Panic of 1907? You have a crash that takes place in 1907 that's just a minor blip. So there's a hiccup with businesses both here and overseas. And for a lot of Americans and for a lot of people around the world, economics wasn't really understood all that well in the early 1900s, late 1800s. It only becomes a real field of science or study in the mid-1900s. And so with the panic in 1907, there's just a really quick downturn. It then recovers fairly quickly, although Teddy Roosevelt has to ask for J.P. Morgan with help again. Because of the fact that the economy is taking a pretty serious dip. And so Teddy Roosevelt's going to give the okay to J.P. Morgan to make his U.S. steel monopoly bigger during the panic of 1907. And then in return, J.P. Morgan helps to stabilize the markets, buy stocks, give confidence. And so the issues that they were having with the Northern Securities case was business. And Teddy Roosevelt and J.P. Morgan were able to come back afterwards and work with one another. The causes are less important than how it's attributed. A lot of the conservatives who are mad about change use this as an excuse to attack Teddy Roosevelt by claiming that his rules and regulations were things that were damaging the government, damaging the economy, and it convinced a lot of people that perhaps they should dial back on his reforms. Not the voters. The voters were very happy with Teddy Roosevelt and wanted him to stick around, but he made his promise that he'd only serve 2 terms and then he would leave office. It's the panic of 1907 also that's going to convince people that perhaps we need to have something more substantial than just J.P. Morgan that we're hoping will help people out. And so we create the Federal Reserve during Wilson's presidency that's going to serve as that central bank that's mimicking what the Bank of the United States was supposed to do when Hamilton and Clay created it earlier. It'll be a bank of last resort so that if the economy starts dipping, it's got some tools that it can use to add money in, take money out, do other sorts of things like J.P. Morgan has been doing, but it'll be the government taking care of that instead. The next question that I have here, dollar diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy is the second of the foreign policies we talked about. That's William Howard Taft's viewpoint. that we should figure out ways to economically influence other countries to get them to do what we want them to do. It involves putting American businesses into other countries, using economic tools to influence other countries. And so rather than relying on our military with the big stick, we're also adding in that layer of financially trying to put institutions in other countries where we will then have control or power over them. Why were the muckrakers important, and who were they? The who were they part is probably easier to start off with. These are newspaper journalists in the early 1900s who wanted to figure out a way to make change happen. You'll hear sometimes people talk about the fourth estate with government, where the fourth estate is meant to be the media in our government, where they're the ones who are supposed to maintain accountability over the people who are governing the country, so that there's somebody to check and balance them, even if they were all on one side. And so that's where the media is coming in with the muckrakers. They're trying to figure out ways to expose corruptions that are happening in the Gilded Age that are being allowed to continue because of laissez-faire. The problem that they're running into is the fact that they've still got to convince a government to do something to help them out. But what they're doing is they're influencing their readership to get more involved in this. So like The Jungle would be a muckraking piece of literature by Upton Sinclair. These reformers also are in it for the money too, because they're involved in newspapers like McClure's and other sorts of big magazines. They realize that you could write either really boring pieces about really boring stuff that's happening in government, or else you can write really exciting things about corruption that's taking place, and that's what they choose to focus on. They're trying to sell newspapers by being exciting and confrontational, so that people are interested in wanting to buy their product. Let me see here. Can I discuss the differences and similarities between the progressive presidents and their political agendas? Sure. So the way that I would look at the three presidents, all three of them are focused on reform, and that's going to be really key in a couple chapters when we get to Franklin Roosevelt, because Franklin Roosevelt famously is going to be about the three R's: relief, recovery, and reform, when getting ready for the New Deal. So when we get to Franklin Roosevelt, it's going to be less about what makes Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson different, and it's going to be much more about the similarities that are between them. That being said, for Teddy Roosevelt, he's the first, and he's very much a trailblazer, where he is very much interested in trying to create reforms that will prevent us from radicalizing as a country. He is very afraid of what's going on with the unions and socialism and the populists with William Jennings Bryan. He wants to avoid all of the stuff they're going to, because he's afraid they're too radical to maintain what makes America what it is. So he's going to create stuff like the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, trying to offer help for unions when they're negotiating, trying to break up bad monopolies but not good monopolies. And so he's going to be very much measured in what he's trying to do to try to figure out ways to level the playing field to try to help out the poor working people inside of our society. When he chooses Taft as his replacement, Taft is supposed to be his clone. At least that's what Teddy Roosevelt wants. But Taft goes off on his own way. He does some things that are still very progressive. When it comes to busting up monopolies, he busts up a lot of them, but it's more haphazard. He's just kind of tearing through them to take them down without much of a strategy as far as why he's doing what he's doing. He's also going to be somebody who will be pushing things like the income tax with the 16th Amendment, the direct election of senators, that'll be coming along as well. There's movements that are happening with the amendments that he is okay with. He's okay with supporting unions, but he's also having problems because he's beholden to the conservatives in the party who don't want a ton of reform. And so like his Payne-Aldrich tariff shows you that he's not all that into reform, although his Mann-Elkins Act, on top of the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act, continues the ICC's work on trying to regulate interstate trade. So he's somebody who is a reformer somewhat, but not as much as Teddy Roosevelt. And that's going to be what makes Teddy Roosevelt mad, is he feels betrayed, especially when it comes to the national parks with that Ballinger-Pinchot affair, where Teddy Roosevelt feels like Taft is selling out his legacy by selling off some of the land that he's built up in the national park system. For Woodrow Wilson, he's kind of a mixed bag, and the thing about Woodrow Wilson is he famously said, I really hope I'm not a wartime president, because he really had a lot of stuff that he wanted to do domestically, and then he gets thrust into being a wartime president in 1914 when World War I gets started. But Woodrow Wilson initially thinks of new freedom, And New Freedom is his philosophy that all monopolies are bad, but he's also a Southern Democrat, so he believes that all government regulation is unnecessary and bad once the monopolies are under control. So his New Freedom is the idea that he's going to use a lot of regulation to bust up all the monopolies, and he wants to go back to small businesses and a situation where you don't need the government to step in because it'll be self-regulating with small businesses instead of big institutions. After a couple of years of trying to break up monopolies and go that route, the war breaks out, and he starts to realize that if you want to go to war, it's much better to have like a U.S. Steel or a Rockefeller Oil rather than dismantling them, having something in place that'll be able to run efficiently during the war. So he's going to shift from his New Freedom to being more like Teddy Roosevelt, who campaigns on new nationalism. And Teddy Roosevelt's new nationalism is the idea. Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm doing a review session. Can I call you back?
Sure.
Okay, bye. Sorry about that. So Teddy Roosevelt's new nationalism is going to be about good versus bad trust still, regulation of businesses rather than getting out of it completely, just allowing the good monopolies to stick around. He wants to start building safety nets for poor people inside the society. He starts talking about like universal health care and other sorts of reforms to try to help out the poor inside the society. And that's what Wilson starts moving towards. He creates the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Underwood Tariff, regulations on labor, the Federal Reserve. He's very much continuing forward the idea that Roosevelt has with his new nationalism, but then he also gets swept into the war effort, and that really ramps up how much the government gets involved. So government's going to take control over almost all business, railroads, factories, and that's going to color what his reforms will look like. By the time we get to the end of the Wilson presidency, people are pretty tired of reforms, especially when communism takes over Russia. And there's a feeling that we've gone too far. And so that's going to bring us into the 1920s where there'll be a backlash against reform. So sorry about the long-winded answer. Hopefully that helps out. And if you have any questions, feel free to buzz back. Any more examples of turning points or defining moments of the progressive era? Galveston in 1900 with the hurricane, 1911 with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. But very much Teddy Roosevelt with his anthracite coal mine stance in 1902 and his beginnings of anti-monopoly behavior. He's the trendsetter. So when you take a look at what George Washington was for being the foundation for what it is to be a president, Teddy Roosevelt really sets a template for what it means to be a reform-minded president because he's the first one to really take that on with gusto. Lincoln did some of it. But he was more reluctant, and most of the presidents in the past have really been worried about going too far, and that's not Teddy Roosevelt's thing. Teddy Roosevelt is very much about, he knows what is needed, he knows that the people trust and like him, and he's a leader where instead of worrying about what the people want first, he's instead the type of guy who will make a decision and then hope to convince the rest of the country that he's on the right side of history. Taft will try to do some of that, but not do it well. Wilson does it better. But then towards the end of his presidency, he has a really severe stroke that undermines his ability to continue that to the end of his presidency, which also helps to end the reform era in 1920. Why was Teddy Roosevelt blamed for the 1907 panic? It was the feeling that his reforms were hurting business. And if you paid attention to the last election, you saw that being used in this past election as well. The idea that Barack Obama's health care reform and other sorts of government interventions had made things bad. So Donald Trump just passed an executive order recently where he said for any one regulation that's created or rule that's created by the government, they want to sweep away two of them that are in existence because there's a feeling that there's too many. And the fact that they're saying that without even considering what the reforms that would be that they'd be wiping out indicates the level of disinterest that many conservatives have right now for the federal government taking on that role. Just like in the early 1900s, there's a feeling that the states should be taking on that instead. Who are the Elkins and Hepburn Acts aimed at? Railroads especially. They're on all monopolies as far as the Interstate Commerce Act, but it's very much dealing with rebates and rates of charging people for transit. It's trying to close up those loopholes that especially the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and Carnegies have been creating with like holding companies and other sorts of things to try to evade what's going on with regulation. It says here, Dennis is blocked from my video. Dennis, you shouldn't be blocked from my video. Let me see what's up. Sorry guys, give me just 1 second. So Reese is saying they're good. Dennis is saying that he's not. I'll be just a second, guys. Okay, it looks like I'm getting full feed too, so let me fire back at Dennis and let him know what I'm seeing. And okay. Sorry about that, guys. So here we go. Can I explain the difference between new nationalism and new freedom? I think we got that. If anybody needs any more help with that question, we can definitely take care of it. Payne-Aldrich bill is something that's kind of tricky, and so it'll be easier for me to run through it when you think about it from the perspective of tariff reform. So from Cleveland's time, Grover Cleveland had always talked about wanting to reform the tariff and shrink it. And then when we had the Panic of 1893, he was convinced by conservatives that that would be a terrible idea because our businesses wouldn't be protected. So Cleveland didn't touch it, McKinley didn't touch it, and Roosevelt really wasn't all that interested in the tariff either. He was somebody who felt like that was a little bit too much of a problem to try to take on. Taft does. And so Taft takes on the tariff to try to convince progressives that he is a progressive thinking guy. Unfortunately, when he's dealing with Republicans in Congress, the Republicans in Congress aren't interested in doing tariff reform in the way that he wants to do it. And so when you think of the Payne-Aldrich tariff, think about where the McKinley tariff was previously. Taft is going to lower it. The other thing is the reformers would love to lower it down to here, but instead it's just going to be lowered a little bit. Secondarily, they're going to add a bunch of things onto the tariff that weren't on the tariff previously, and so you've got a whole bunch of stuff that now has new taxes that they slip in, and so they're able to announce to everybody, hey look, we lowered tariff rates, ignoring the fact that you've now got a bunch of other stuff that's being taxed. And so for Americans, the Payne-Aldrich tariff feels like a double cross where they're not being treated the way that they want to by Taft, and they wonder if Teddy Roosevelt would be acting that way. Teddy Roosevelt, when he left the presidency, he was somebody who went off on safari to Africa and then met all the world leaders throughout Europe, and throughout the entire trip, his ego was being constantly by the fact that he was getting telegrams from people saying that they missed him. And so that's kind of what's stoking him into the election of 1912. Can I go over Wilson's acts? I can. Which ones? We've already gone over the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is going to stretch the Sherman Antitrust Act. Underwood tariff is going to radically lower the Payne-Aldrich tariff, so we're going to actually have a ton of tariff relief. And when you put that together with the 16th and 17th Amendment having the direct election of senators and also the income tax, the progressive income tax, there's going to be a taxation on rich people that's going to be much more than for poor people because they feel like they're the ones who have been benefiting from society and they're best able to be able to be able to pay for that. There's pushes to deal with child labor. There is a push to help out with farmers, and so there's farm loan programs. that are meant to help out so that he can convince the populace that he's on their team. There's going to be the passage of the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote, and the 18th Amendment making alcohol illegal. His Federal Reserve is going to create a central bank that's going to be sitting on top of the banking system so that we've got a bank of last resort to give out loans when there's a panic taking place. He's going to create the Federal Trade Commission, which is going to be getting into regulating business practices and trade so that it's on the up and up rather than being secretive like it's been in the past. So there's a ton of stuff that Wilson is up to, but we will also run through it tomorrow when we come to class, and so we'll be able to discuss it more there. Reese, if you feel like there's anything that I'm not hitting that you need more detail on, I'd love to help you out, so just feel free to fire back another question if you need to. Says, why did women advocate so much for prohibition? When you think about prohibition, I want all of you guys to be able to do like a long linear thread when you're thinking about prohibition. The idea that the prohibition movement has been around since the early 1800s. When you learned about the Second Great Awakening, you had people who were during those town meetings talking about demon rum, and we talked about like Currier and Ives where they were making those lithographs of like the drunkard's progress. So there's been an anti-alcohol movement for a long time. And in the late 1800s, it gets transformed because it turns into a nativistic movement. The idea that you've got Roman Catholics coming over as Italians and Irish people. And the whole narrative that they have is that they're drinking too much alcohol, which convinces them to have too many children. And so perhaps all the crime and population growth and immigrant stuff that's happening could be cut out by going with prohibition. For women especially, they felt very strongly about this issue because they would watch, especially during economic panics, many of their men would then resort to drinking to try to escape the problems that they're having with the economic crashes. And a lot of women are then watching abusive husbands come home, their money going out the window, and so they see an element of alcohol leading to unreligious behavior. And they're supposed to be the center of the family with the cult of domesticity, protecting their family's religious nature. So especially during the Victorian era, women are being told that they're the morally pure, ethically good people. They're dressing from neck all the way down to ankle. And so this feels like one of those elements where they're trying to protect their families and society by getting rid of alcohol. Let me see here. What is the Clayton Antitrust Act? So Clayton Antitrust Act is just an extension of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And you saw during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency that the Sherman Antitrust Act wasn't working very well because it was written by business people through the Congress in the late 1800s in order to protect monopolies rather than tear them apart. We learned in the late 1800s about the E.C. Knight case, the United States versus E.C. Knight, where you had a sugar trust that had over 98% of the control of the sugar markets. And the conservative courts at the time argued that since it wasn't 100% control and since they weren't impeding trade, that they weren't a monopoly that was punished by the Sherman Antitrust Act. So their standard is really high. And then Teddy Roosevelt is personally going to lower that standard, and so will Taft. But the problem is you still have this slippery standard over what is a monopoly, what is a trust, what's the problem with holding companies, and all those other tricks I was teaching you in the late 1800s. And so Wilson wants to clean that up. The other big thing that Wilson wants to clean up with the Clayton Antitrust Act is he saw that during the strikes, you would see the government like Grover Cleveland use the Sherman Antitrust Act to break the strikers that were on the strike for the railroad by claiming that they were blocking trade. And that's part of the Sherman Antitrust Act, is you're not allowed to impede trade. The Clayton Antitrust Act is going to exempt labor unions and farmers from being punished by the antitrust acts. So this is only going to stay focused on the businesses themselves, which is what they're trying to target. Let me see here. Why had conservative courts been ruling trade unions under anti-monopoly restraint? Oh, so it was a tactic that could be used, and it was the benefit of lawyers knowing how to argue. And so one of the things I like about our debate classes and mock trial classes is it teaches people how to argue. One of the things that I dislike about when lawyers argue is they can take a point and into a literal meaning from the laws that isn't what the spirit of the law was. And so in the late 1800s, there were lawyers who were able to find sympathetic judges who didn't like labor unions all that much, And so they would go in front of them and point out that technically, according to the Sherman Antitrust Act, even though a monopoly wasn't a trust, they were a union of people who were working together to restrain trade, and they felt that in that narrow window, that was enough justification to then say that they were violating the Sherman Antitrust Act and that they should be punished by breaking up their union activities. One of the tactics they would use would be an injunction, where the court would issue an order telling the people who were in that activity to cease and desist for the time being, which means that the judge could break a strike by telling them that they had to stop for a while, because once it stops, the business owner will be able to take control. He'll be able to threaten the workers. He'll be able to restore all of the factory, and he'll be able to get rid of all the momentum, which is just the time that the factory owners would need. And so that's the reason why the courts are going the direction that they are. They've got friendly relations with the business owners, especially since many of those politicians were appointed by people who were running through political machines, and their decisions would help then the people who had helped them get the positions of powers that they had. So it was the concern that we had in the late 1800s that perhaps the spoil system needed to be cleaned up, and that's what you saw going on with the Pendleton Act starting, but it still was pretty dry in the early 1800s. That's the last question I've got on my sheet. I'm assuming that you guys are good. For us, our goal is to keep constantly improving on our multiple choice tests, and so hopefully tomorrow goes well for you. Like I mentioned today, when you come to class, we'll just quickly run through the Wilson presidency. I'll be checking my emails tonight and tomorrow, so if you have any last-minute questions, especially about the Wilson stuff, I can type you up some pretty detailed stuff if you have any sort of questions. But we'll be able to deal with that before class starts. Your test will be 35 questions, and so you'll be able to have plenty of time during the second half of class to be able to knock out the test and be fine. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. If you're coming to intramurals, I look forward to seeing you there. But otherwise, good luck with your studying. Hope it goes well. Good night.